Welcome to the pilot episode of The Case Finder, a frank and open conversation about reported legal cases and current affairs with a resident retired judge, Phil Willans. We hope to squeeze from Phil all this generational knowledge so we can pass it on not just to lawyers, but to anyone who cares to listen. My name is Donna. I'm a lawyer by trade, but for today, I'm just your case finder. Good afternoon, Phil.
Hello there, and I'm Phil Willans, a retired solicitor.
Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Well, I've known you for how many years now, Phil? 15?
Must be at least there, probably longer. When you started as a trainee, I think, with Solicitors.
Just down the road, a couple of doors away from Phil Willans & Co, isn't it?
We were sister ancient firms of the old star.
Well, tell us more about yourself, about your practice.
Well, in terms of law, it's something it's occupied my whole life. I started when I was 18, when I took what were then called articles. That's a form of apprenticeship training to be a solicitor with a firm in London. It was done on a form of block release rather like they used to training engineers. So you spend 6 months in the office and you go to law school for 9 months. After you've finished that and hopefully pass the exams, you then did a period of 2 years in the office. Then at long last, you went back to do your final exams, followed by another period in the office. So those 5 years were your articles. And after that, you qualified and were admitted as a solicitor. So I was admitted in 1970, and I practiced finally with my own practice as a sole practitioner until September 2015. So overall, 50 years.
50 years of legal practice.
50 years of legal practice.
Across, I think you told me, pretty much all areas of law, which was not uncommon at that time.
No, it was far more normal. When I was still practicing, there were still a few people left who were what you might call 5-year men, people who trained as articles. And I say men because most solicitors, certainly in the 60s, were men. I mean, women were not even allowed into Law Society headquarters in Chancery Lane. In the 1960s, they weren't. You had to be male, basically, to get in. You had to be a qualified solicitor to be able to use the common room. And if somebody absolutely had to see a woman, then there was a little room at the back of the building, with this back door, called, I think, the Marble Room. And so the lady concerned could wait there for you.
So interesting. And when did that change?
Well, it started to change from the 1970s on. In 1970, there was a tiny number of women who were solicitors. Now it's at least 50%, but it might be more.
Yeah, correct.
The Law Society's rules were opposite a place called Elvino's, which was a sort of a watering hole for, well, in those days, printers as well as journalists and solicitors and barristers in the Strand, which was not opposite the Law Society, but very close, a few hundred yards away. Women weren't allowed in there for many, many years. So that these were sort of bastions, really, of the males in those days. Not that anybody thought about it like that. That just happened to be the case.
Happened to be, what's true at that time, as we call it.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the way the world was.
Yes.
Likewise, the 5-year articles were a common arrangement. It was a situation where if you lived in Stallings, for example, you wanted to be a solicitor, your uncle might be one, or you might know, your father might know a solicitor who was prepared to take you as his clerk. So you lived at home with mum and dad, and you walked to work, and you didn't need to be paid any money or very much money because you lived at home. And so you trained in the firm. When you qualified, normally you stayed in the firm. And so as the older partners retired, there were always younger partners to take their place. You had a succession. And that was changed completely by the Law Society.
And when did that, again, the theme of this, when did that start to change?
I suppose maybe in the 1980s, it's when they introduced rules, one which provided that solicitors must pay their trainees.
Right.
An outrageous suggestion, but you had to pay They even told you how much money they had to pay.
You've heard that from me.
They even told you how much a minimum you had to pay them. And the other thing was they raised the entry qualification, which when I started was A levels, to a degree only, which in effect cut off the supply of local clerks.
Right.
So local, my children are 18, but local youngsters couldn't pursue it. They couldn't take an apprenticeship or pursue a career in a local firm. They couldn't get to know it.
Right.
And they'd take the business on because everybody had to recruit their potential trainees from afar. The bigger firms in London competed with each other for the best trainees.
Yeah.
And so, not that they were going to come and work for a firm that's St. anyway, but they competed for the best trainees available. People who wanted to pursue legal careers from all over the country could go anywhere in the country, but they had to be paid. And it just changed the whole dynamic.
Yes. The barrier of entry is being quite, well,
It totally changed it.
totally changed.
Essentially, I mean, apart from the technological and other economic changes which have gone on over the years, they effectively succeeded in cutting off succession for local practice. So if you were to walk along, for example, St. Albans High Street today, I could point out where all the solicitors have been, and they are no longer there. Because my generation, if you like, as soon as we reached the end of the plan, country jumped off or pushed off, that was the end. There was no succession.
Yeah.
And so
it's because of this, we call it just poorer of youngsters.
We didn't have any youngsters to take over.
Didn't have the succession.
No, it's
the landscape wasn't there for them to stay in their local firm and to take over uncle's practice, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. So if you looked, they used to have a magazine called Weekly Law Notes, which was very interesting, and it had various articles in it. One of which was a conversation between NT, nephew Tom.
Oh, you mentioned this, yes.
And WS, worldly solicitor. And that was the format, this was his uncle. And they used to have a conversation about a legal problem, which was educative, so that you learned from it. But that mirrored the way the legal profession was. And then, of course, you had the enormous expansion of legal aid from the Second World War, which resulted in the growth of firms. And then over, it must be the last 20 years, the steady dismantling of that, which has contributed to the collapse.
Yes,
all those things.
Yeah, I've been qualified 10 years now, so I've seen, and then trained for 2 years before that, and a couple of years of work experience before that. So I've definitely seen that tail end of that development. Yeah.
So you don't have a private practice. I mean, forget about the economic changes, but you don't have private practice the way it used to exist. That, of course, and the ending of the monopolies.
Yes.
Because when I started to train, there was a scale of fees, for example, for conveyancing laid down by the Royal Society, which people adhered to. That went.
Yes.
Margaret Thatcher didn't just deal with the coal unions and the other unions. Her cold wind blew through the professions as well, including law.
Yeah.
So that all of those changes really resulted in a complete altering of the landscape.
Interesting. I'd like to think, because you asked me earlier what was the stimulus for this, and I knew it's somewhere from our conversation, and I remember that Uncle Tom and
no, it's nephew Tom.
Nephew Tom
and
worldly solicitor, and we'd like to think this is the 21st century version of the worldly solicitor and the niece Danna. Talking about cases, legal problems, but it not in print format, but obviously in this updated format of a podcast.
Moving with the times.
Moving with the times, indeed. Well, we're going to have we need a few episodes to tackle the entire 50 years of legal landscape, but it's good to talk about it now. It's good to have that knowledge of history, because I certainly didn't learn that from university. I'm looking at one of our colleagues here who's the next generation from myself, and she's also nodding that they weren't taught the historical landscape of legal practice, not law. We're not talking about case precedent here. We're talking about how our industry changed, the supply, the demand, the pricing, the barriers to entry. We sound like a business school now, but all of those, which impacts career opportunities.
Change fundamentally, really.
Absolutely. Career progression.
Mm.
The look of the 21st century law firms. All of us are looking at, doing this podcast, a different type of marketing. We're looking at reaching clients in a different manner. Geographical restrictions is no longer quite an issue.
No.
But pause for that, because let's park that for a moment, because if we do talk about that, I think we'll be here until tomorrow. I'd like to ask you, because like worldly solicitor and nephew Tom, we're going to talk about a case later on. But before I press you on about a case, I'd like to ask you, what's your favorite historical legal case ever? 50 years of legal practice.
I think the first one, which was in my first 2 weeks of articles.
Without breaking confidentiality, I would say, of course.
In those days.
The Law Society might be ringing us now live.
Well, there's a clue in the nature of the case. But the firm I was articled in had a very large criminal practice and litigation practice. And they used to use their trainees or their article clerks very often as court bodies, so that a barrister would be instructed to conduct the case in court, and you would be the representative of the firm to be there with the file and to help the barrister and act as a sort of a link between the barrister and the client. And during my first 2 weeks, I spent 2 weeks at the Old Bailey following one such case where we represented somebody who had been involved allegedly involved, I should say, allegedly involved in the escape of a very famous criminal from one of London prisons. May I say who it was?
Yes, please.
It was the escape of Ronnie Biggs from Wandsworth. And we represented one of the men who was accused of helping him to escape.
Right.
And it was in one of those grand old courts in the Old Bailey, what I call the Charles Lawton course. He was an old actor who often played a barrister. It was one of those all wood courts with loads of atmosphere. And courts 1 to 4 in the Old Bailey. I forget which one it was. We coloured. And so I spent 2 weeks sitting in the Old Bailey, and that was my introduction, really, to the world of criminal law. An interesting aside, I mean, the guy, Ronnie Biggs, escaped from prison during exercise because a furniture van was driven alongside the wall, and from the top of the van, a rope ladder was slung over the wall.
Right.
Which he then shinned up.
Gotcha. And someone obviously kind of given him a leg up.
Well, the ladder got him up, and on the top, he got to the furniture van, which was raised.
Right.
Had a contraption which raised it, dropped into the van, into a waiting car, and away.
Amazing.
And off to South America. And so the men who allegedly helped to escape were tried at the Old Bailey, and that was we represented one of them, and that was my first experience of criminal law. And I didn't notice, I'm sure I'm not mistaken about this, but I sometimes wonder, because I used to have to go and interview people in prisons as the years went by. I'm sure as I walked along the road past Wandsworth Prison, they'd raised the wall a bit.
It's not jesting. Yeah, there was a longer term consequence, because it wasn't obviously tall enough.
I'm sure that the coloration of the bricks changed. In those days, you go along to the prison. I mean, there are loads of prisons in London. Wandsworth, or the old-fashioned ones, they have a main gate.
Yes.
And then there'd be a sort of a turnkey's door, and you'd knock on the door. The grid would swipe back and then have a look at you. And you go inside and say, solicitor, you had to have a letter of authority.
Yes.
And then you went into a waiting room opposite, which was full of visitors, for people going to some. These days, I think, again, that's much more formalised and different.
What made this case compelling to you, apart from obviously the raised prison gates?
The sheer audacity.
Yeah.
The sheer audacity of arranging an escape from this prison and pulling it off, I think, was, in other circumstances, a bit of, in a wartime situation, they'd all got on medal, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it was a brilliant.
Yes.
In fact, there was a terrible pop song introduced not long after that called Over the Wall We Go, Cocktails and Nanas, which was very unfair. but that was the sort of the tenor.
The tenor of the
It was
time.
the sort of the Italian job tenor.
Right, gotcha. So there was a sort of urban legend
Yes.
flavor to it,
This is just me
aftertaste.
looking
Yeah.
back. This is just me looking back. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
something you should.
When was this? 1980s?
No, much earlier.
Much earlier.
Much earlier.
70s.
Yeah, well, it
Shortly
must have
after
been.
your.
I mean, I was articled in September '65 at the trial then, so it must have been a couple of years before that. Must have been about 63.
63. You mentioned 2 cases, Phil.
As
was the second
big as,
one.
of course, has been one of the great train robbers. So
Right, yes. Oh, you handled that case?
No. This was. I wasn't. I was still at school at college then, but that's what Biggs was in prison for, and
he was helped.
having been one of the great train robbers.
Escaped, yes.
Where they robbed the mail train in Bedfordshire, I think it was.
Wow. I think there was a few movies made.
Oh yeah. Well, it's right. I mean, that's what happened. You know, they actually stopped. The mail train was stopped. Now, this poor bloke, one of the blokes got melted an egg with something and had a very nasty injury. But all that was history. That was history. And then the other interesting case was the Hanratty one, because one of the police inspectors, I mean, one of the things we used to do was use prosecute as well as defend. And on one such occasion, obviously you got friendly with police officers, and so were your witnesses. And one of them had been based in Bedfordshire when the body of the chap who was shot dead and left in the slip road was found.
Right.
You see, so you had that kind of connection because Hanratty had since been hanged for the murder.
Yep. When was this? Before 1964, 65? Because that was must have been because of the end of the capital punishment round.
Ended in the early 60s.
Yep, correct. It must have been one of the last few ones hanged.
Can't be very many.
Yeah.
Can't be very many. I think it's about 62, 63. They didn't. I don't think they abolished it. I think they more or less just suspended it.
Until I think they kept it for treason.
But it was arson in Her Majesty's shipyards.
Oh,
interesting, really, to hear comments from people who have been involved.
Yes.
And then there was Janie Jones, poor girl. Was it Janie Jones? That name came to my mouth. Whose body was found on No Man's Land Common.
Right.
Who had been abducted in North London. She'd been trying to sell a minicar. And it's thought that the guy who was responsible for her death saw it, approached her, got in the car, and then took her away and raped her and murdered her, and brought the body out to No Man's Land, where it was left and later discovered by some individuals.
I understand.
The character concerned was an extremely violent man. I mean, he spent his entire time in prison weightlifting. And whenever he was interviewed, the local coppers told me that whenever they interviewed him, they'd have about 6 coppers in the room and him handcuffed.
6 coppers? Even at him being handcuffed, there's still 6 around.
He was a very strong man. And he got a long record of extreme violence towards women. And he was doing time. And the evidence which they collected, we learned subsequently, pointed to him, asked him about it. He wouldn't talk. But while he was inside, there were lots of developments in forensic science and DNA. And of course, they were the DNA proved it was him. So as he walked out for one sentence, he was met by some officers and taken straight back in, more or less.
The passage of time did not work in his favour.
No. He was known, the newspapers called him the Beast of Shepherd's Bush.
Beast of Shepherd's Bush. 80s?
Probably the 80s.
Probably the 80s.
I honestly couldn't say.
North London, Shepherd's Bush.
It's like Ruth Ellis-the. I mean, I can remember as a little boy. I'll tell you, as a boy when she was
1954, wasn't it? 1954, something like that.
Yeah, sometime like that. I can remember seeing her face on the front of the paper.
There's renewed interest to it. We just talked earlier. It's now on ITV. What made it interesting then, and what's making it interesting up until now? We're 70 years later.
There's several things really. I think those days I can remember as a boy, hangings used to be announced. They used to have a picture in the paper. So usually it was Albert Pierpoint who was the public executioner.
He wrote a book, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, he wrote a book. Yeah,
a picture of a guy with a trophy and a raincoat and a bag on his way to an appointment at some prisoner. And we all know what that meant.
Yeah, what that meant.
So
Yeah.
they sort of announced in advance. But there was an enormous campaign about ending the death penalty. And I think that particularly that contributed enormously, plus the fact that she was a woman, contributed to the campaign to end the death penalty. That was it then.
Yes.
Now, I think it just has an enormous human interest because instead of a sort of a run-of-the-mill murder, it's something committed in the course of a crime or something.
Crime of passion.
More sort of. It has elements which were different.
A bit more human landscape, a bit.
Yeah, very poignant and.
There's lots of layers to it. There's domestic abuse, wasn't it?
Probably. I mean, from what I had a neighbour once who knew her boyfriend that she shot. I don't know how he knew him, but he said, "Well, as mad he was." Now, whether that's true, I don't know. I don't want to slander.
No, we're not here to slander. Yeah, proven until
innocent
until proven guilty, as we say. Yes.
But even if they're right that she had been abused, yes, and she was perhaps been taking drugs, drink and so on. Nonetheless, I mean, as a lawyer, she went to the scene unarmed.
Yes.
With the intention of killing the man, and she did. And whether or not somebody put her up to it or helped her, that may be the case, quite possibly was. And so there are other ramifications for that individual or individuals, but notwithstanding that, she still did the act. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. So whatever death penalty was very extreme, but it's what society prescribes in any given set of circumstances, and then that was the penalty.
Here's a question, Phil. If you were her defense solicitor, defense lawyer at that time, how would you approach this case?
I think that the only chance she would have stood under the law as it was then was to try and claim diminished responsibility. And to do that, you could have needed medical evidence. And quite possibly, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but quite possibly that could have been argued if she was using substances which affected her state of mind, and if she had been subjected to the sort of cruelty which we hear about, then it might be possible to argue that. But if the court finds you, then it would have to be guilty but insane.
Yeah. And then mitigating circumstances are going to be pleaded.
What happens to you if that's the finding?
Yeah, what happens?
You go to Broadmoor.
Was that the sanatorium as
well, it's indefinite.
Oh, okay.
That's my notice. I had a client who went that way, who killed her stepfather, and she was, odd.
Yeah.
They accepted a plea of not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter.
Understood.
And I mean, because of the medical findings, if she'd been sent to prison for murder, 10, 15 years maybe.
Yep.
In effect, she was in a mental institution for the next 30 years.
So that was the choices, obviously.
It wasn't thought of as a choice at the time, but that was the outcome of what happened.
Yeah.
That it was an indefinite sentence.
An indefinite somewhere else. A different type of prison, so to speak, isn't it?
Yeah.
One could say.
Well, if you went to Broadmoor, all of the nurses were warders with white coats on.
Yeah.
They had a uniform underneath.
Right.
Oh, yes. They were prison warders, but with a white coat on. You could hear the keys jangling.
Yeah. It's just a quintessential facility, isn't it?
They were locked in. So I'm not so sure on reflection.
Did they argue diminished responsibility in the Ruth Ellis case?
I don't know.
I doubt it at that time.
I don't know what.
Were they limited by her conduct and her pretty much, was it a concession?
Well, she, from what I haven't read all that much about it, but I gather that she was quite clear in what she said, and she didn't try to to diminish her responsibilities, so that really, I mean, she always left them with no choice.
Yeah. Yes. I
It
understand.
was a do what you like situation.
Clearly, there's a capital punishment is now abolished. Long since. But what do you think would be the outcome if the Ruth Ellis case was tried in the recent times? By recent times, 21st century.
Well,
The last 5 years, maybe.
you never know, because given that a jury decides guilt or otherwise, I mean, juries.
Just an inkling.
They're perfect. I suspect that if there were good defence lawyers who went down the press Bolton line, that if they convicted us, they might put in a plea for mercy, or they might just simply decide not to convict her. I mean, if the jury decides not guilty, that's it.
That's it.
You can't, it's autrefois acquitted. If you're acquitted, you can't be tried again.
Yeah.
You can't be tried again. So that it could be the case that if their social conscience was such, they gave her freedom and it wouldn't matter what the judge said or thought.
Understood. Do you think that capital punishment at that time, before it was abolished, or at that time of Ruth Ellis, was an effective deterrent? That's the first limb of the question. And secondly, without being too controversial, and you could say, I'd rather not, not answer. Do you think there's place for it in this modern times?
I don't think that capital punishment's ever been a deterrent.
Right.
Because I suspect if you were to analyse murders,
yes,
I'm not convinced at all that the existence of a death penalty would dissuade someone from acting.
Yeah.
I think the majority are domestic anyway.
Yeah.
But regardless of the cause, I don't think it would dissuade people from acting in that way. So I don't think it would ever act as a deterrent, but I would never see it as such anyway. Even now, I would see it simply as society. If there was a death penalty, and I think there is an argument for saying that there are some crimes where it would be appropriate, but it would be a matter for society as a whole to say, this is the consequence of your acting in this way. Because society determines, largely the law is going to get, it determines the behaviour it's prepared to put up with and what then happens if someone infringes. It has to. So if society is prepared to put up with particular acts, however appalling they may be, then so be it. Personally, I think that it wouldn't be a deterrent. I think that there are some cases where it would be entirely appropriate to say, well, that action on your part is so unacceptable that this is the consequence.
Have you seen a substantive change from when you started your career up until now of what the society is prepared to put up with?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, I think so, yes. I think that that's occurred across a whole range of behaviour. But we're talking, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, so I can't really say with reference to any figures or any kind of stuff.
Just from observation.
But just from observation, I think there has been a decline in self-discipline, really. And I'm thinking particularly of schools where some teachers are subjected to all sorts of appalling behaviour. And society doesn't seem to step in to protect the teachers or to protect society as a whole. So what can that be other than a falling off in discipline?
Yeah, I understand.
And the society's obviously bent for that. I mean, you'll get several page-long headlines in the newspaper about some poor headmaster who's been stabbed to death in front of his own school. What does that achieve? Yeah, it doesn't achieve anything. So since you asked, I do think there's been a decline in the strongest form of discipline is self-discipline.
Yeah.
And if it isn't inculcated or taught by, or given as an example by parents, maintained through schools and maintained through every fibre of our society, then you're going to get behaviour which follows in the face of that. And are we prepared to put up with it? Yeah, largely because it doesn't happen in places where people have a voice. So if it were in Hartlepool,
Yes.
I can assure you, you'd never hear the last of it.
Yeah.
Every single MP that was within 10 miles of would have an awful lot of trouble. Just by way of example, I don't that's about Hartlepool, but I mean, there are some places.
It's a neighbour, Harpen. We're in St Albans. That's the
right.
reason. It's just proximity. No offence.
They're never going to be subjected to the same sort of conduct which other people are in other areas.
Yes, that's
where they are not listened to.
Yes.
And they simply aren't. And it would be like, so in terms of immigration, there's a lot of trouble in Ireland at the moment because the Irish are far more outspoken about these things. And if a number of people turn up that equal or exceed the locals, then they get cross about it. Well, it did happen in England, but with the results we know, or something similar happened. But if it were to happen if something of that sort, just to take it as an example, I'm not making a point about immigration, but if you took a lot of people who are illegal or otherwise and put them in Hartlepool or some other leafy southern city, you'd never hear the last of it. Things would be done. So there's a definite difference between areas and the response that people show and exhibit and get away with today.
That's interesting. So it's not just time, the passage of time. It's demographics.
It's demographics as well.
Yes,
It's
what we're prepared to put up with, and obviously it's fed back to the MPs, and as we call it, it's up for the Parliament to give clarity as to what they are prepared to legislate, so that us lawyers, officers of the court, can interpret, relay, apply those laws made by our democratic representatives.
They're supposed to be our representatives. Well, who are they representing?
Well,
it's usually people with the loudest voices. But I can assure you, if you pick somewhere like, unfortunately, Hartlepool, I was selected just because it came into my line. But if you pick somewhere like that, then there's a very well-educated, very strong-minded population living in Ireland, and the places like it, they will not take things lying down. They will know what to do and how to do it. So that's the difference, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. And this delusion of self-discipline, what do you think is prompted, or what was the provenance of this trend, I suppose, or this change that you observed from the last 50 years of legal practice, the last 50 years of just being a professional or just a local resident? What do you think, and when do you think this delusion started? You don't have to answer a particular, putting you on.
Just being various. I mean, somebody one day will write a book and get it right, no doubt. But there've been all sorts of.
Or someone commenting somewhere. It's a free country.
There'll always be somebody at the end of the day who will up say, "No, I told you. I said it was going to snow." Nobody else realised. But there's always somebody who's right, whether it's an economist or a Met person, or whatever it is.
Or here's an interesting case. Was it a byproduct of something that's changed with time? Was it a byproduct of technology? Was it a byproduct of other changes?
I think a great many changes have brought about an alteration, really, in lots of aspects of our society. Things change. Change is an essential fact of life. Was it some Greek philosopher said you can't tread in the same water twice if you're crossing a street. The water's always moving. It's always different water. And the same is true now. So and it's not just now. I mean, you could actually look historically. People often talk about people adversely comparing now with the past. But if you actually read about the past, the 19th century and up to the First World War, my word, some of the things that are happening socially and economically are appalling, absolutely appalling. So that by comparison with then, we live in an infinitely better time. Infinitely better time. So
we talked about that in our readings of Yuval Harari, didn't we?
Yeah.
That book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
Takens.
I mean, if you were around when the factory system got going, working there from the age of 7 or something, I personally don't see any harm with you working to the age of 7. Jolly good idea. Not 12 hours a day.
No, 12 hours a day. Yeah.
But and also William Cobbett, who wrote Rural Rides, thought that was far better than education. He was very much a supporter of the young child that helped his father in the fields and did far more good than spending her time poring over books trying to learn things. So there's always been a range of different opinions. But I think that if you by our standards, if you look at the way they lived, what their lives entailed and compared it to now, there's just no comparison. Now it's infinite. I mean, we live in the most extraordinarily comfortable, luxurious way, even if you are less well off.
Comparatively to obviously 200 years ago or 300 years ago.
50 years ago.
50 years ago.
If you were to compare the lot of most people with the 1950s, I mean, we didn't finish rationing till about 1955. Just take that, leave aside accommodation and the lack of inside bathrooms and all the rest of it. Even within our own country, prosperous country, over a relatively short period of time, you can by comparison with then and now, there is no comparison. We live like nabobs, like Indian nabobs in the 19th century.
Yes. Well, that's quite an interesting reflection of changes and passage of time and a comparison of progress, a comparison of development when one feels that it's a tough. We had this conversation before and we said it's pretty hard going out there, and then you step back and you look at 50 years ago they had rationing. Plumbing's quite archaic. 50 years ago we didn't have internet, or you guys didn't have internet. You didn't have the access to all this information. We talked earlier about wanting to know stuff, and all we need to know is type in YouTube and how do I fix my how do I fix my and this is from real life. I think I've fixed my my washing machine. I'm remotely not a plumber at all. Yeah, exactly. Hourly rate is very similar to my hourly rate as a solicitor, but that's interesting. And because I'm glad you pointed out Pierre Point, because one of my research says here he wrote a book which was published in 1974. The book carried a shocking admission. The fruit of my experience, and this is quote, the fruit of my experience has this bitter aftertaste that I do not now believe that any of the hundreds of executions I carried out has in any way acted as a deterrent against future murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieved nothing except revenge. That's what he said.
I'd agree with that remark, respectfully, Mr. Purpoint. I mean, it's that's why I don't think it can act as a deterrent. But it's I would never. Obviously, I wouldn't advance that as an argument for supporting capital punishment. I can't honestly say that I'm a supporter, but I do think there are some crimes where a capital punishment would be appropriate. I mean, it doesn't take too many minutes to work that out, does it? If you think of Frederick Weston's wife, for example, or that school janitor that killed those 2 little girls. That sort of.
That we talked about bitter aftertaste. There's just that.
Yeah, there are some.
And palatability is strong.
Some cases where you just so out appalling.
Yeah. What's the major takeaway from this Ruth Ellis case? If you're watching this series now in the year 2025, I wasn't around when it happened. It's back on ITV. What's the biggest takeaway? What should we look for, and how could it be useful for us, whether lawyers or not, when we look at this case?
Well, my biggest takeaway actually is the extent to which women's lives are infinitely better, because women in those days, Ruth Ellis included, even though she's not worked in this good time joint in London, their lives were immeasurably more repressed and sad by comparison to now. now women have the opportunity to lead full, engaged, active lives, and that's entirely right and proper. So the saddest thing I think about her case is the extent to which it was back in the 1950s, and life was so much drearier and repressive, really, in a way. I'm not making a political point.
No, no.
That's my opinion. I just think that there was everybody has potential, and she, without question, would have done like everybody else, and she was, in a sense, partly a victim of the time she lived in.
And final question, as it's our first podcast, and going with the theme of comparison of times, what would be your best advice for surviving the legal industry, given that you've survived it for 50 years? You've survived and thrived for 50 years. So I won't ask you how you survived. I'll ask you for an advice how to survive. Different landscape, but, what's the takeaway from that? 50 years in legal practice. How can we have 50 years as well?
Keep learning. I don't think you should ever reach a plateau where you think that's it. If you are qualified here, what's wrong with being qualified, say, in your case, in the Philippines or in America or in France as well? Have as broad a view of where you can practice as possible. These are only systems that have been developed historically by different places. And in other words, it's to maintain your interest in the detail. That's one. And the other, I think, is to have as balanced a life as possible, so that you, just by way of example, enjoy exercise, enjoy the company of friends, and so it just doesn't become the whole single defining factor of your life.
And that's what got you through the last 50 years and more.
I suppose, by and large.
By and large.
By and large. I never thought about it by and large, but I think you're right, actually. That's by and large right.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. Okay. It is an absolute pleasure. Phil will be a returning co-guest. I've already asked you. I've already committed you whilst recording, so I have evidence of your commitment. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's always great to hear your thoughts. We've done this in the past privately with our team inside the firm, but we're now sharing it with the rest of the world, hopefully, or whoever cares to listen. Exactly. But again, thank you so much. Pleasure. And we'll see you again for another episode of The Case, The Case Finder.